In the 1920s came the 19th Amendment that gave the women the right to vote. Women have been fighting for the right to vote for over 300 years. One important woman was Alice Paul. Alice Paul co-founded the Congressional Union and then formed the National Women's Party.
All right, let's go to the thought bubble. The suffrage movement was extremely fragmented. There was a first wave of suffrage exemplified by the women at Seneca Falls, and this metamorphosed into the National American Women's Suffrage Association, or NAWSA. Most of the leadership of NAWSA was made up of middle to upper class women, often involved in other progressive causes, who unfortunately sometimes represented the darker side of the suffrage movement, because these upper class progressives frequently used nativist arguments to make their claims for the right to vote. They argued that if the vote could be granted to ignorant immigrants, some of whom could barely speak English, then it should also be granted to native-born women. This isn't to say that the elitist arguments won the day, but they should be acknowledged. By the early 20th century, a new generation of college-educated activists had arrived on the scene, and many of these women were more radical than early suffrage supporters. They organized the National Women's Party, and under the leadership of Alice Paul, pushed for the vote using aggressive tactics that many of the early generation of women's rights advocates found unseemly. Paul had been studying in Britain between 1907 and 1910, where she saw the more militant women's rights activists at work. She adopted their tactics that included protests leading to imprisonment and loud denunciations of the patriarchy that would make Tumblr proud, and during World War I she compared Wilson to the Kaiser, and Paul and her followers chained themselves to the White House fence. The activists then started a hunger strike during their 7-month prison sentence and had to be force-fed. Woodrow Wilson had half-heartedly endorsed women's suffrage in 1916, but the war split the movement further. Most suffrage organizations believed that wartime service would help women earn respect and equal rights, but other activists, like many progressives, opposed the war and regarded it as a potential threat to social reform. But in the end, the war did sort of end up helping the cause. Patriotic support of the war by women, especially their service working in wartime industries, convinced many that it was just wrong to deny them the right to vote. And the mistreatment of Alice Paul and other women in prison for their cause created outrage that further pushed the Wilson administration to support enfranchising women.
Danced and voted. She cut her hair short, wore makeup, and went to parties. She was giddy and took risks. She was a flapper. Before the start of World War I, the Gibson girl was the rage. Inspired by Charles Dana Gibson's drawings, the Gibson girl wore her hair long, loosely on top of her head, and wore a long, straight skirt and shirt with high collar. She was a feminine, but also broke through several gender barriers for her attire that allowed her to participate in sports, including golf, roller skating, and bicycling. In June 1922's edition of the Atlantic Monthly, G. Stanley Hall described looking in a dictionary to discover what the evasive term flapper meant. The dictionary set me right by defining the word as a fledgling yet in the nest and vainly attempting to fly while its wings have only pin feathers. And I recognized that the genius of slanguage had made the squab the symbol of budding girlhood.
That takes us to the rise of Hollywood. In the 1920s, the movie industry started to boom. The first movie with sound came out in 1927, The Jazz Singer. The Jazz Singer was a big hit in theaters, but some theaters without sound went out of business. The top 5 studios, also known as the Big Five, were Warner Brothers Pictures, Paramount, RKO, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, and 20th Century Fox. One of the most popular comedies of the 20s was The Gold Rush, starring Charlie Chaplin. Charlie Chaplin is a famous actor in the 20s. He starred in many different movies.